Hello, nature lovers. Do you love to read books like I do? I've always enjoyed reading books ever since I was a kid, especially books about nature. Unfortunately, as I get older, I find myself with less and less time to sit down with a good book. I've solved that problem with Audible. Audible allows you to listen to your favorite titles while you are driving, at the gym, taking a walk, wherever you are. With all the latest titles, you'll have quite a selection to choose from. And they have podcasts too. Start listening today with a free 30-day trial. To get your free 30-day trial, go to the show notes and click on the link. Happy listening. Hello, friends. I'm Paul, and this is the Nature Wanderer podcast. And I'd like to wish everyone a happy World Bee Day. It's actually, and I don't mean the letter B, I'm talking about bees, as in buzz, the buzzy bees. Yeah. World Bee Day. May 20th, which is this coming Saturday, is considered World Bee Day. It's a designated holiday by the United Nations. So this is not just a national day, this is a world day. It's celebrated all over the world. Basically, the UN came up with this idea because they saw how bees were in trouble and they wanted to bring more awareness to people about bees and how important they are to the survival of the planet, to our survival, and to help people understand how they can help the bees to survive. So let's begin by talking about bees in general. There's actually 20,000 types of bees in the world. 4,000 of those species of bees reside here in the U.S. as native species. There have been some introduced species into the U.S. As with most places, bees are imported. Bees accidentally slip into cargo. So they do move around the country, but native bees, ones that have always been here, there's about 4,000 of them. Bees live all over the world except for Antarctica. Not much lives there, a little bit too harsh an environment. And bees depend on flowers. You don't find many flowers in Antarctica. There's 5 main families in North America. The Apidae is the largest. That family includes the bumblebee, the honeybee, sweat bees, and many more. And we're going to talk about the different types of bees in a little while. Why are bees so important? Well, in order to talk about the importance of bees, we first need to start by talking about pollination. For those of you who don't know what pollination is, basically it's taking pollen from one flower to another flower and dropping it off there. Insects are the carriers of the pollen. They pick it up from one place, they go to another place to gather more pollen, and when they do that, they accidentally drop off some of the pollen from the other flower, and that helps to fertilize that flower. So it's all about the reproduction of the flowers. So bees feed on and require both nectar and pollen to survive. The nectar is for energy, and the pollen provides the protein and other nutrients that the bees need. All of this is done by collecting this nectar and pollen from different plants, flowering trees, flowers. Any plant that produces pollen or nectar is a friend to the bees. That's where they gather their food. As they're doing this, they fly from one place to another. Whether it's a flower or a tree, they're transferring the pollen from one flower to another, thus fertilizing that flower so that it can survive. Now, bees are not the only pollinators out there. Bees are one of the more important ones, one of the more common that we know of, And they're probably one of the biggest of the pollinators. But there are other pollinators. For instance, bats are pollinators. Flies are pollinators. Butterflies are pollinators. There's all different kinds of pollinators out there. 90% of all wild flowering plants depend on pollinators for their reproduction, for their survival. 75% of the world's food crops also depend on pollinators. So a lot of the foods that you have in your pantry and your refrigerator, a lot of the foods that you eat are depending on pollinators. Without pollinators to help these plants reproduce, we don't have food. And this is why pollinators such as bees are extremely important to humans. We need them to keep our food supplies going. Actually, without pollinators, our entire diet would have to change in order for us to have food. We would be eating more grains rather than fruits and vegetables. So we need these pollinators. So when these bees, big pollinators here, are going from one flower to another, they're helping not just the flowers, but in the long run, they're helping a lot of animals. They're helping the ecosystem, and they're helping humans. They're helping us because they're helping our food. As a matter of fact, a lot of farmers who are seeing their crops start to dwindle or diminish, they are bringing in beekeepers to set up hives around their crops so that the bees will go right to their crops and help pollinate them, so that it helps the crops grow better, helps them reproduce. That's how important these bees are. Now, bees are amazing creatures. I actually raised honeybees for several years. I stopped doing it this past year. All of my hives, I had 3 hives that I kept. All 3 of them didn't make it through the winter, and I took it as a sign as this is my time to get out of beekeeping. But I did pass my equipment on to someone else who wants to start beekeeping. The only reason that I did beekeeping was not for the honey. I did get a little bit of honey from them, but usually like midsummer, I stopped collecting honey. I let the bees have it. They worked for that. They earned it. It's theirs. Let them survive the winter with it. My main purpose for raising bees was to get the pollinator population up, to increase it, to get more pollinators out there, because pollinators are in trouble. And we'll talk about that a little later on. I always think about when these bees are flying from one flower to another, how amazing it is. And you may think, well, they're flying around. What's so amazing about that? Hey, can you fly? I can't. Well, unless I get into an airplane. But we can't fly on our own. Birds, bees, they can. But bees shouldn't be able to. Looking at the physics aspect of a bee, scientists say they should not be able to fly. The wings are way too small. How on earth do these tiny little creatures with wings that are way too small for their body size get off the ground? Scientists have been studying it for many years, trying to figure it out. How can these creatures fly? They're not made to fly. The wings are way too small for the body weight. Well, they did all these studies and they found using slow motion video that besides going up and down, the wings are actually twisting as they're flying. So it creates less friction on the upbeat and more on the downbeat, and that allows them to get up in the air. A bee actually will beat their wings about 230 times per second, not per minute, per second. 230 times. And they're getting that little twist in there with every single wing beat. Just amazing. But these guys get up in the air in that way. Now, there are a lot of different types of bees out there. One that most people are probably familiar with is the bumblebee. But you probably didn't realize that there's not just one type of bumblebee. There's actually more than 250 species of bumblebee. The bumblebees are a little bit bigger than the honeybee. Bumblebees are the ones who most people think are very solitary because we see them flying around us, usually only one, not a whole bunch of them. But bumblebees are actually very social, just like honeybees are. They build colonies with the queen. They don't build nests up in the trees. They don't build the big hives. What they do is they build their nests in the ground. Usually they find an old abandoned mouse nest and they'll build their hive down in that nest. And they create an entire colony with workers, a queen. They act very much like a social honeybee. Now, the male bumblebees will not sting. Females will. Unfortunately, females are usually the ones we see flying around, and they will sting you if they're bothered. Remember this. Bees usually only sting if they are bothered. If we're annoying them, they're going to try to protect themselves. They're going to try to protect the hive. Matter of fact, honeybees keep a group of bees called the guard bees around the entrance of the nest. They kind of keep an eye on the traffic going in and out, and they make sure predators stay away from the nest. Have you ever wondered why beekeepers always wear white? Well, that's because bees throughout history have associated animals with dark colors as predators, as trouble, as problems. For instance, bears. Yeah, bears love honey, just like Winnie the Pooh. Yeah, they love honey. They will decimate a colony just to get at that honey, and bears are dark in color. So a bee does not see the white as a threat. That's why beekeepers usually wear white when they're tending to their colonies. So these guard bees, they're watching the entrance. And when a predator comes by, they will defend that hive, that colony, from the predators. They will sting them. A lot of times when I was tending to my bees and I was collecting honey or I was just cleaning things up around the bees, whatever I was doing, if I disturbed them too much and they got very aggravated, most of the bees, when I walked away, they would go back into the hive and go about their business. They're busy creatures, so they didn't have time to just go chasing me around. But I would have probably about 4 or 5 of them following me. I'd have to walk quite a distance before they stopped following me. Those were the guard bees. They were ticked off enough to keep after me, to make sure I wasn't going to return. Little did they know, hey, I'm coming back. So bumblebees set up their colonies very similar to the honeybee. Now, another type of bee we have around, carpenter bees. Now remember, there's 4,000 different species. I'm not going to talk about each one. These are some of the more common ones in the northeastern U.S. The carpenter bees are the ones that a lot of people don't like, not because they come down and sting you, but because they make these holes in our houses and the overhangs in our houses. They make holes in a lot of wooden structures. The reason is because they bore these holes in the wood for nesting sites. They actually have cutters in the front of their mandibles, their mouth, that allows them to bore these holes into wood. They're just looking for a nesting site, a place to raise their young. That's the only reason they do it. They're not trying to be mean. They're not eating the wood like a lot of people think. They're just creating nesting sites. So if you can give them a nesting site, maybe a bee box somewhere on your property, they'll usually leave your house woodwork alone. Not always. No promises here. They are a nuisance to gardeners too. Not because they're going after the wood, but because they're going after the nectar. Now, the nectar is deep down in some flowers, and the bee has trouble getting to it, the carpenter bee. So what they do is they will actually bore a hole at the base of the flower. They stick their head in, and they get the nectar. Now, that sometimes, not always, but sometimes will kill the flower. It damages the flower anyhow, but it could kill it. Now, another problem with this is if they're not going to the top of the flower, they're bypassing the pollen. They're going right towards the nectar, which is at the base. And doing that, they don't get any pollen on them. They go to the next flower, they're not pollinating it. So your carpenter bees are not big pollinators. They do very little pollination, as a matter of fact. Now, the next type of bee I want to talk about is a really neat bee, and I had a really interesting experience with them. It was actually my first experience with these guys when I wandered up to Nova Scotia in Canada. And my wife and I were out doing a hike at a local nature center up there. And we were just walking along a trail with tall grass on both sides, but the trail was mowed down the middle. And there were all these little bumps in the middle of the trail, dirt bumps with holes. And I was trying to figure out what they were, so I stopped and I just looked at them, trying to think, well, that hole looks a little bit too big for it to be an ant, unless it's a really big ant. I wasn't familiar with all the species up in Canada and Nova Scotia. I didn't know if they had some new species I didn't know about, but all of a sudden I see this green head poke up, this iridescent green head, shiny metallic green, and all of a sudden it disappeared when I got close. I took a bunch of pictures because as I was watching, these green heads kept poking up and down out of these holes all around me. I took lots of pictures so I could figure out later what these critters were. They had the face of a bee, but I didn't see the rest of the body because they never poked more than their head out. But that iridescent color just fascinated me. Bees are yellow, not green, so they couldn't be a bee. When I went back to my Airbnb, I sat there and did a little research. I found out that these were bees. These were actually sweat bees. Now, the sweat bee is a ground nester, obviously. They're a very solitary bee, unlike the bumblebees and the honeybees. These guys like to be alone. They'll share an area, so you may have several of these holes, like I saw, all in one area. But each hole will have one bee in it. They don't make colonies. They will go out, mate with a male, go back into the hole, raise their young, and when the young are old enough to take care of themselves, they fly out and they make their own holes. So it's all about being alone with the sweat bees. And actually, most bees are very solitary. There's only a small handful that are social and make the colonies. Now, sometimes a sweat bee may share an entrance, but they'll have separate nests inside that entrance. So if you see more than one sweat bee coming out, it's probably because they're sharing an entrance. Now, the sweat bee is a really neat looking bee. Like I said, the whole body is pretty much shiny metallic green. Now, another bee that's pretty interesting is the mason bee. Mason bees get their name because they use mud and other masonry type products to build their homes. They are solitary, just like the sweat bees. They like to live alone. They have their own nest. They don't make colonies, although they can live together near each other, but they don't make these colonies. They don't have the social structure of the honeybee. They are hibernators, which is pretty interesting. They don't have a long lifespan, but they will hibernate through the winter. Then the spring, they mate, lay eggs, and shortly thereafter, they do die off. there's rarely more than one generation living at the same time. Now, the mason bee is an excellent pollinator. They're one of the top pollinators out there. They don't make honey, so they collect pollen for their brood, not the nectar. As they're going from plant to plant, they will collect pollen and they pollinate the flowers. Now, the next bee I want to talk about, the leafcutter bee. These guys are pretty interesting. Another solitary bee. They're excellent pollinators as well, just like the mason bee. Scientists have discovered that one leafcutter bee, just one single leafcutter bee, can pollinate as many flowers as 20 honeybees. That's amazing. They are cavity nesters, like mason bees. They like to live in small holes. Usually if you have a twig that is hollow, they'll build their nest in there. Maybe a small hole in a tree that a woodpecker made, a small one. They don't want a huge hole. They will make their nest inside of those holes. Now, they line the nest with leaves. They actually go up to a leaf and they cut it. There's videos on YouTube. You got to watch them. They're amazing. They cut this circle or this semicircle in the leaf very quickly, in under 30 seconds. They'll cut this piece off, they grab it, carry it away, and they roll it up and put it inside that hole, and that's how they line their nests with it. So it's pretty interesting. If you see a hole in a tree and you see a leaf sticking out all rolled up, that is the home of a leafcutter bee. Now, those lined nest sites will carry the eggs of the bee. So they lay their eggs inside of those leaf-lined holes. There's another guy that a lot of people consider to be bees, but they're not. You ever have that tiny little guy? He looks like a very underweight bee, and they fly around and they hover right in front of your face staring at you. They're so annoying. It's kind of like my dog when she's hungry or wants attention. She'll just sit there and stare at me like, get off your computer, Dad. Stop reading that book, Dad. It's my turn for attention, my turn for a dog biscuit, and they just stare at you. Well, these little bees do the same thing. I should stop calling them bees because they're not a bee. Those little guys that look like a bee, only they're a little bit skinnier, and they hover in front of you, that's what we call a hoverfly. So please don't mistake them for bees. The last bee I want to talk about is probably the most well-known bee, and that's the honeybee. Now, I do want to let you know that the honeybee is not a native bee to North America. They were actually imported from Europe in the 17th century, so quite a while ago. But a lot of people, because they've been around for so long, and they're the ones that we usually raise for the honey, we consider them a native bee. But the honeybee is not a native bee. They're actually from Europe. And we now import them from a lot of other countries as well. We import them for the honey. And some people also import them, like I was talking earlier, the farmers will import them for the pollination aspects of the honeybee. I think the farmers should probably look more at leafcutter bees because the leafcutter, like I said, 20 to 1 better pollinators than the honeybee. Now, honeybees are a social bee. Honeybees can be found out in the wild. Usually they're escapees from the captive bred bees, but they will make their colonies inside a hollow tree, maybe an old woodpecker hole, and they create a very organized colony. Every bee in that colony has a job. Now, there's one queen who basically runs the entire hive. The only time she leaves the nest is when it's time to mate. All the drones will be flying around in this big cloud, and she will dart through this cloud and mate with several of the drones, then go back into the hive and lay her eggs. Now, she lays all the eggs in the hive. Some of them will be workers, some will be drones, although other females can lay drones, but she's the only one who can produce a female bee. She is also the one who will lay the eggs who will eventually become her replacement queens. But that only happens when she dies. And the workers realize that they need a new queen, so they will produce a new queen by providing a special type of honey. Royal honey, as they call it. They feed these baby bees the royal honey, which will eventually create a queen. It makes them larger. Now, they will create several queens, but the first one to hatch, the first one to come out, will be the true queen. And the reason for that is because she goes around and finds all the other queen cells, and she goes in and kills them so that she will be the only queen. Every honeybee nest can only have one queen. And then you have workers, and they work their way up in jobs. Some of them will take care of the babies, and others will be the workers in the nest creating the honey. Others will also be the ones who tend to the queen. And then, of course, you have the workers who fly out and gather nectar and pollen. So everyone has their job in the colony. So very intricate, very organized colony. Now, eventually, if a beekeeper has a colony, and I've had this happen several times, where I will split my colony because it's getting too big. And when I see a lot of aggression and a lot of crowding in the hive, I usually will split it. Now, sometimes I miss the split, and they will split themselves, what we call a swarm. And all of a sudden, you'll see a big cloud of bees over the hives, and they suddenly disappear. What happened is some of the workers were out looking for a new place to live because they knew, hey, we're getting too crowded in here. We need more space, and this beekeeper isn't adding new space to our hive, so we're finding a new place to go live. Usually the queen goes with them. Once they find a new place, half the hive with the queen will usually head on out, find a new place to go. I did catch a swarm once. I had a swarm just over to a tree while they were waiting to find a new place to live. They went over to one of the trees that was probably about 20 feet from the hive, and they just formed this big 3-foot long, about a foot thick clump of bees. And I went up with a garbage bag. I put it over them from the bottom, closed up the top, and I took them over to an empty hive that I had, and I poured them in there. And sure enough, that hive was reestablished. So if you catch a swarm, it's great. If you don't, they're going out to the wild and creating their own colony there. And the colony that the queen left has to create a new queen in order to survive. So it gets a little complicated with these bees, but like I said, very organized, and they know what they're doing. Now, I mentioned at the beginning of the episode about how important bees are because they're pollinators, but I also mentioned that they are in trouble. Now, according to the United Nations, and this is in their words, bees are under threat. Present species extinction rates are 100 to 1,000 times higher than normal due to human impacts. Close to 35% of invertebrate pollinators, particularly bees and butterflies, and about 17% of vertebrate pollinators, such as bats, face extinction globally. Wow, 35% of bees and butterfly pollinators, 17% of bats and other vertebrate pollinators, are facing extinction. So that's what I mean by bees are in trouble. If this trend continues, crops such as fruits, nuts, and a lot of vegetable crops, they'll start disappearing. And we'll have to substitute with things like rice, corn, and potatoes, which not very balanced for a human diet. So we need to be careful about what happens. So what's going on? What's causing this to happen? Why are humans? The UN says that humans are the cause, the major cause. Pesticides, herbicides, cutting down our flowers. I'm actually recording this, looking out at my lawn and seeing all the dandelions in my lawn, which I think is beautiful. They look lovely. But most people, they see dandelions, what do? They spray herbicides on them, get rid of them, or they keep cutting their lawn. Dandelions are amazing. They keep growing shorter so that they avoid the lawnmower blade. My wife and I actually made some cookies with dandelions in them. I got the recipe from an Instagram that I follow, Savory Moments. I'll put the link in the show notes to the recipe from Savory Moments so that you can enjoy these too. But get out there before the dandelions disappear and make sure you pick them in an unsprayed area. We don't do any spraying on our lawn, so we always pick the flowers from our lawn if we're going to be using them. So it's stuff like that. Mowing constantly. Destruction of habitat. Not having enough places for bees. This is all harming the population of pollinators. So what can you do? Can you do anything? Yes, you can. Some easy things. First of all, avoid pesticides, fungicides, herbicides. Don't use them in your gardens, whether it's a flower garden, a vegetable garden. Don't use them. Use alternatives. There's a lot of different things, and our podcast is way too short here. I'm not going to get into them. Look them up. There's a lot of natural methods to keep harmful insects away from your flowers without harming the bees. Plant native wildflowers, or at least a variety of flowers. Flowers that bloom at different times of the year. That way the bees can have pollen and nectar throughout the summer, the entire summer. Not just in the spring when all the dandelions are up, but all year long. Plant some flowering trees in your yard. Flowering trees, wow, when they are in bloom, they're actually very beautiful. All the white flowers on them, all the yellow flowers. These flowering trees have thousands of flowers on them. The bees love them. I love walking past a flowering tree in bloom in the springtime, and the whole tree is just buzzing. I'm not worried about getting stung because I know they're too busy collecting pollen and nectar. They're not going to bother me. They're too busy doing their own thing. So plant some flowering trees in your yard. Also participate in, it's kind of a new fad, No Mow May, or you can call it Low Mow Spring or Low Mow May. During the month of May, avoid cutting your lawn. I know, you probably live in a town and they have an ordinance. You have to keep your lawns well groomed. Or you don't want to let it grow too long because if you do, it's going to bog down your lawnmower. The top part of my lawn, close to my house, it grows so quick. So quick. So I have to mow it constantly to keep it low enough. Otherwise, if I keep letting it get too high, it clogs up the lawnmower. I get clumps in my lawn. I try to keep my grass a little bit long, but I don't let it grow the entire month of May. So I participate more in Low Mow Spring, where I will keep it cut higher and I try to mow it less during the spring. That way the flowers will grow. Like I said, I'm looking at a ton of dandelions right now, and a lot of other wildflowers will grow on my lawn as well. And that's fine with me because the bees love it. Also, create a bee bath. I know, what's a bee bath? A bird bath we're all familiar with. The birds will just go into the bath and wash themselves and get a drink. Well, what's a bee bath? Well, bees need water too. They actually carry the water back to the hive to keep it cool in the hot summer days. So if you create a small bee bath, maybe a small dish, put some water in it, and just let it sit out there. Now be careful, you want to change it regularly. You don't want mosquito larvae growing in there. You also want to make sure it stays clean enough so that bacteria isn't growing in there. So try to change it daily, but just a small bowl will help the bees. And of course, support your local beekeepers. How do you do that? Buy your honey locally. It's also good for allergies. If you're one of those people who has a lot of allergies, local honey is produced from local flowers. So if you're allergic to some of the flowers that are locally growing, then local honey will actually help those allergies. So support the local beekeepers. It helps you and it helps keep more bees locally so that more beekeepers can help produce more pollinators. So all of these are easy ways that you can actually help these pollinators. Remember, our lives depend on it. Our survival depends on these pollinators. The big things: avoid pesticides, plant flowering trees, plant wildflowers that grow year-round, don't mow your lawn as much in the spring, create a bee bath, and support the local beekeepers. Well, unfortunately, it looks like we've come to the end of the podcast for today. We've run out of time. I hope you enjoyed wandering through nature with me. Don't forget, invite your nature-loving friends to join us. If you haven't already, please hit the subscribe button. Take a minute to rate and review the podcast. If you have any nature questions or ideas for future episodes, feel free to drop me a DM on my Instagram page, which is at @TheNatureWanderer _ in between each of the 3 words, or my website at naturewanderer.org. You can also support the podcast by joining my Patreon, which will also give you extras, including videos, education classes, pictures, and much more. Show your support of the podcast and your love of nature by supporting a Nature Wanderer t-shirt, water bottle, backpack, puzzle, or more, which can be purchased at my store, which is linked in the show notes, or from my website. Have a great week and keep exploring the nature around you.